Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. At last, technology-wise, we're all set up. Sometimes in history, the largest events turn on the smallest of things that prove the popular saying, truth is stranger than fiction. Often, these unpredictable events culminate in catastrophic consequences. Academics broadly describe them as black swan moments. And it was truly the blackest swan moment that befell the world, and the man whose memory we are here to honour today, while he was only 16 years of age, while serving on his first trip to sea as a deck boy. Here's food for thought. If the work product of Frank William Walker and his shipmates on the Blue Funnel liner Automedon had not brought their ship into a close encounter with German surface raider Atlantis at 0758 on the 11th of November 1940, Japan just might not have attacked the American fleet in Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, or even at all. Frank and his shipmates may well have been directly but unknowingly responsible for turning what was until then a purely European conflict into the Second World War. I will explain that controversial statement during the telling of Frank's story. More about that later. So who was Frank Walker? I never knew Frank in person, but I got to know of him soon after my wife and I came to live on Mariners Park through his bench. Close to the old entrance gate to the park stands a memorial bench with a small brass plate bearing the simple inscription, Frank's Bench. It tells us also that Frank's life extended from 1924 until 2008, but nothing about the man or his life. I made a point of pausing to sit on Frank's bench for a few minutes on my return from shopping forays and to share a few words with him. His plaque says so little about the man that I determined to find out more. There's not a lot of information available about his early life, but with research and the help of his lovely wife Vera and others, this is what we have managed to piece together. So, who was Frank Walker? Frank William Walker was born into modest circumstances at Rusholme, Manchester on the 22nd of August 1924. He then lived with his parents in rented accommodation near to King Street, Wallasey. The boy suffered an unhappy childhood since he could do no right for his father, who took every opportunity to lay his hands on the lad. His parents were at constant loggerheads with each other. His mother and father were at battle stations where their altercations often ended with his father resorting to violence that spilled over onto Frank. Frank's first discharge book records his height as 4 feet 4 inches. His smallness in physical stature attracted the attention of teasers and bullies who gave him the nicknames Winkle and Titch, names that stayed with him for the rest of his life. In spite of his size, Frank grew into being nobody's pushover, which strengthened his character and inner resolve. Although he enjoyed a loving relationship with his mother, he could never do right for his father. The times Frank spent at home with his dad were often punctuated with verbal abuse, clipped ears, and even more forceful beatings. Frank, nevertheless, developed a fun-loving and genial nature that endeared him to his peers. Money was always tight in the family, and that added to the tensions in the home. When he was 11, all of his schoolmates had bicycles, and not having one left him out of their two-wheeled outings. He pleaded with his mother for what he knew was the impossible. "Mum, can I have a bike? All my mates have got one." To his delight and great surprise, she said, "If you pass the 11 plus, you can have a bike." "Wow, do you promise?" "Yes," she replied. Frank did pass the scholarship, but his triumph coincided with the total collapse of the family home. Frank's father went off, never to be heard of or wanted again. His mum couldn't pay the rent and they had to get out. They were homeless and his mother sought to find live-in work for herself, but she couldn't take Frank. And he had to go into care with the Sisters of Mercy in Yew Tree Lane, Liverpool. Frank was on his own, with no bite, no dad, no mum, no home, and no prospects. Life with the nuns was not unlike the times when he lived with his father. He couldn't do anything right for them either, and frequently had to endure their tongue lashings and corporal punishments. Frank hated it there. He remained out of contact with his mother while she remained without a permanent address. Occasional respites from the sisters' harsh and unloving regime occurred when a distant aunt would call to take him to a home in Sale for weekends. It was a form of escape for him, but it happened only rarely. The Sisters of Mercy ran a school on their premises, but it was a girls' school. Frank had to go further along Yew Tree Lane to continue his continue his education at St. Vincent's School. It was not the grammar school he had hoped to attend after passing the 11+ examination. Frank got on well enough at school, but it bothered him being so much on his own. He still had no address for his mum, and he began counting the days to his 14th birthday, when he could leave school and this place where he was billeted and fend for himself. With the emergence of that thought came a sharp shock. Where would he go to live? What would he do to provide for himself? How would he even manage to survive? The answers to those questions lay all around him and in every direction he cared to look. Frank would join the Merchant Navy and go to sea. The great day finally arrived. On August the 22nd, 1939, Frank turned 14 and reached the obligatory school-leaving age. The boy lost no time making the acquaintance of the Canadian Pacific Personnel Department at the Pierhead in Liverpool, and on the 19th of May, 1939, he went to sea as a bellboy on their Duchess of Richmond. Frank enjoyed the work and his life at sea among the passengers, plying CPR's liner services to Canada. His Discharge A book became a treasured possession, for it defined him as a legitimate seafarer, a man of position, earning his own livelihood, and he was still only 14. The first page of his discharge book reveals an interesting feature of the early days of the war. In the previous world conflict, genteel ladies would roam the streets of the nation seeking out menfolk of military age who were not already in uniform to shame them into joining up by branding them with the white feather of cowardice. It was already 1939, but the war had not yet started at this time, but this practice was already seen to be resuming. Merchant seamen have always been civilians who wore civilian clothes instead of a military style of uniform. These were men more precious to the nation in topping a derrick at sea than in toting a rifle in the trenches of Flanders. To protect them from the zeal of these unofficial female recruiters and to ensure valuable seafarers were not pressed into joining the armed services, the Department of Transport devised a badge of national service to be worn by seafarers wearing civvies when ashore, thus protecting them from harassment and the manpower of the fleet from recruitment into other services. This actually is Frank's badge that was issued to him, and you can see at the top left-hand corner of his discharge book, badge MN issued number 4141. Every badge was registered to an individual seaman, and this one is Frank's, an original one, struck by the Royal Mint in sterling silver, and you can recognize it by the horseshoe lapel badge on the back. These are still, so the Royal Mint struck these lapel badges in sterling silver in a traditional Merchant Navy design. Although the badges are not individually numbered, each one was issued and registered in a seafarer's discharge book at the local marine office. According to Gabe Thomas, an ex-registrar of shipping and seamen, there were 144,000 merchant seamen serving aboard British vessels at the outbreak of war, and this number increased to 185,000 as the war progressed. That's a lot of badges, and as you can see from here, this is taken from eBay, this slide, this slide here, that's on for sale, these original ones, for £25 a piece. That's where they start the auction from. Well, but we've got ahead of ourselves. Let's rejoin Frank while he enjoys a world cruise on the Duchess of Richmond while the world is still at peace. There you might find him on Waikiki Beach in Honolulu. That's how it was in 1940 when Frank swam off that beach just in front of the Royal Matson Hotel there. He celebrated his 15th birthday there and probably proved to be his most memorable visit. Life was sweet, but it couldn't last. Frank was in Havana on the 3rd of September when war was declared. Duchess of Richmond returned to Liverpool, where she resumed her regular runs to Montreal and Quebec. Her passenger lists were now comprised mostly of European evacuees escaping the onset of Nazism. There we see Frank. Here we see Frank in photographs with some of the younger evacuees who are on their way to escape the Nazi tyranny and build new lives for themselves in Canada. One can't help noticing Frank having to stand on the companionway steps to attain parity in height with the girls. Well, I suspect only Frank knew what went through his mind at this time with regard to his own future. His discharge book shows him to have changed not only his employer, but his department also. He paid off the Duchess of Richmond on the 21st of August 1940 and joined Holtline's Automedon on the 23rd of September 1940, but as a deck boy. Oh. And there's Automedon when she was new and built in 1922. Frank obviously wanted a more secure future at sea than bellhopping provided and sought to change over to the deck department. However, he managed to achieve this is anybody's guess. Adolescents seeking employment at sea at this time had to undergo a medical examination to prove themselves robust enough for the tasks ahead. They also had to be of a minimum height, 5'4", and Frank had only 4'4" when he went to sea 12 months previously. How he got past this difficulty remains a mystery, but he heard Automedon was looking for crew and secured a berth on her as a deck boy the day before she sailed for Durban and the Far East on the 29th of September 1940. He remarked that he had found life more arduous than when he worked for Canadian Pacific and was constantly being shouted at by a crewman nicknamed by his shipmates as the Terror of the China Sea. This man seemed set on making the deck boys' lives miserable, but being bawled at was nothing new to our Frank. After all, he had grown up with a father and a cloister of nuns who had constantly bawled at him. Automedon was a refrigerated cargo passenger ship of 7,528 gross registered tons, built for ocean steamships, Holtline, by Palmers of Jarrow and launched in 1921. She was a vessel of 459 feet length overall and 58 foot 4 inches beam, and she sailed on summer marks at 26 foot 2. A twin turbine vessel geared to a single shaft generating 6,000 shaft horsepower to deliver a laden service speed of 14.5 knots. The only item of modern equipment aboard the navigating bridge was said to be a rather indifferent wireless direction finder. Her manifest listed her cargo as crated aircraft, motor vehicles, spare parts, whisky, cigarettes and foodstuffs that included 70 tons of frozen meats. In her strong room, she carried 120 mail bags, sensitive documents and $6 million in new Malay currency. She sailed for Freetown in convoy on the 29th of September and thereafter proceeded independently to Durban, where she arrived on the 25th of October to load stores, provisions and bunkers prior to commencing her Far East rotation. Automedon was officially designated a DEMS vessel, a defensively equipped merchant ship. For her defence, she was armed with an old World War I 75mm cannon. A trained DEMS gunner was usually carried on board, who might be a retired artilleryman, or even one of the vessel's crew might be trained in the gun's management and firing procedures. It would always have been a David and Goliath situation, with scant chance of success in any encounter with an enemy warship. The gun's presence, however, served to instill confidence in the crew that they were able to hit back if they encountered an enemy vessel, and it was better than nothing. What only her master knew was that Air Chief Marshal Sir Cyril Newell, the head of the Joint Chief of Staff's Committee and member of the War Cabinet, had left in his care a slender, weighted green bag with eyelets driven into its canvas so as to allow water ingress if jettisoned, and it was labelled top secret, to be destroyed. It was addressed to the Commander-in-Chief British Far East Forces, Sir Robert Brooke Popham, and to be opened personally by himself. It contained documents from the War Cabinet Planning Committee with a full copy of the Joint Chief of Staff's Far East appreciation of the military strength of the British Empire in the region. It also contained full details of the RAF units, their naval strength and assessment of the roles of Australia and New Zealand in the event of Japan entering the war. Most piquant of all, a long paragraph containing copious notes on the fortifications of Singapore. Whatever had possessed Newell to place such a precious document on board a lumbering, slow, independently voyaging and virtually unarmed merchant vessel for conveyance to Singapore instead of aboard a warship remains a mystery. A greater mystery since the man it was addressed to left the UK 10 days after Automedon by air. And additionally, and perhaps more seriously, is the mystery of why her master, Captain William Brown Ewan of Hartlepool, did not dump it over the side when the raider that attacked him first hoisted her Nazi battle ensign. These questions are still perplexing historians today. And this is what happened to the Automedon while Frank was aboard her. On sailing from Durban on the 20th, that's views of her at the bottom there, the bottom. On sailing from Durban on the 29th of October, Captain Ewan shaped his course for his next port, Penang, passing south of Madagascar. Second Officer Donald Stewart kept the 4 to 8 bridge watch. At about 0700 on the 11th of November 1940, he sighted the presence of another vessel, 34 degrees on the port bow, on a course to close with them. He was unable to identify her form when she appeared over the horizon and called the master in accordance with his bridge standing orders. Captain Ewan joined Stewart on the bridge, and in silence they together observed the approach of the other vessel. Captain Ewan believed it to be of a Dutch configuration and determined it safe, drawing on information from the latest Royal Naval reports that stated hostile raiders and U-boats were operating north of Madagascar. Nevertheless, Stewart asked if he should adjust the course to starboard to pass clear of the other vessel that now appeared to be on a converging course. He received no immediate answer from Captain Ewan, and so they maintained their present course. At about 0730, Helmsman Stan Hugel heard the master say to Stewart that he still thought it to be a Dutch ship and that he believed they had come far enough east to be out of danger of raiders. They had the previous day picked up a distress call from other ships in this area, including one from the Norwegian tanker Ole Jacob. Automedon had believed it to be a false alarm and ignored it. This call, it transpires, had been interfered with and manipulated by German surface raider Atlantis. According to 2O Stewart, the course alteration to pass through the strong and complex currents of the Bengal Strait and into the northern Malacca Strait to head for Penang, their next port of call fully occupied Captain Ewan's mind. He planned to make this change at night, and without benefit of radar or shore lights, relying only on the ship's celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and a rather contrary and rather rarely trustworthy direction finder for his safe passage. As regards to the present convergence, Captain Ewan decided to maintain his course and speed and return to his cabin. 2O Stewart entered in the logbook, course to be maintained, and he conveyed the master's order to his relief at 8 bells. Captain Ewan was a man of medium build and in his early 50s. He sported a full head of silvery hair and was a taciturn man by nature. He enjoyed the respect of his crew, who found Captain Ewan to be a strict disciplinarian and a master who exuded dignity and confidence while surrounding himself with an unapproachable attitude. Yet, for such an experienced shipmaster, he made several serious errors of judgment on that Armistice Day in 1940. Had she turned her bow to starboard and steamed at 14 knots, a speed well within her capacity, and approached closer to the shipping lanes along the Sumatran coastline, as Stewart had suggested, she might well have been able to elude her pursuer. The captain of the Atlantis, Captain Rogger, said something to that effect to Donald Stewart when talking together on board Atlantis subsequent to the attack. This remark being overheard by Automedon's fourth engineer, Sam Harper of Liverpool, who repeated it to the American consulate in Marseille in early 1941 after his successful escape from France. In an interview in 1962, Second Officer Stewart stated that he went to his cabin on being relieved at 0800, and at around 0820, while he stood shaving in his underwear, he heard the sound of gunfire. He looked out of his porthole, which was adjacent to the master's accommodation, and was astonished to see the Dutch ship flying a swastika, and now steaming on a parallel course to Automedon and in close proximity to her. He rushed from his cabin to wake Extra Second Officer Wilson and then woke First Officer Peter Evan and followed them in a scramble to the bridge. On his way there, Stewart noticed the ROs were still busily transmitting the RRR distress message, not realizing that Atlantis was jamming their output. There followed a thunderous bang. Stewart said the blast of which tossed him into the air like it was a leaf and landed him unconscious on the bridge deck. Helmsman Stan Hugel had not been relieved at the time of this explosion that almost buried him in debris, but left him unharmed. 2O Stewart had run out of his cabin, undressed and with shaving soap covering his chin. Luckily, he survived, whereas the captain and 5 others, including Extra Second Mate Wilson and his relief Third Mate Whitaker, had perished in the blast. Ewan's decision not to alter course sealed Automedon's fate. An hour after first being wakened by Stewart, Captain Ewan lay dead with 3 brother officers among the debris that was his navigating bridge, while 12 lay wounded, with 3 other crew members lying dead elsewhere aboard the ship. From Captain Rogger's memoirs and Atlantis' war diary, we learned that the ships detected the presence of each other at about the same time. On Atlantis, able seaman Jenner stood lookout duty in the foremast crow's nest and reported a smudge of smoke on the horizon. Rugger ordered his crew to action stations and steered a course to intercept the vessel, believing it to be Automedon. It seems he knew she was coming. At 07:58, her war diary put them 4,600 meters apart, 2.5 miles. At 08:03, Atlantis revealed her identity by hoisting her swastika battle ensign and hoisted the international signal flags for "Do not raise alarm," together with another signal ordering Automedon to stop. Minutes later, they were now just over 3 cables apart, 600 meters, and Atlantis augmented her signals by firing a warning shot across Automedon's bow from her forward cannon. The awful tragedy that befell Automedon was now about to happen. It was now too late and impossible for Captain Ewan to extricate himself from the situation and prevent the ensuing assault by Atlantis. According to a later report made by helmsman Stan Hugel before the bridge exploded, he said that the bridge team was staggered by the suddenness of the confrontation and were unable to decode the signal flags quickly enough for the German radar. Meanwhile, in the radio shack, First Radio Officer John Rawcliffe and Second Radio Officer Philip Buck carried out the captain's order to continue transmitting an RRR message, code for "I am under attack," by a radar, and to do so repetitively. Unknown to them, as they continued to key the distress message, Atlantis had jammed its transmissions 2 seconds after the first transmission. Only the latitude of the encounter got away on the airwaves. Hugel recalled he heard Captain Ewan order the wheel put hard a starboard to put Automedon's stern to the radar. He repeated and executed the command. He then heard the captain shout out vigorously, "Come on, everybody, let's do it. We are going to fight." A balaclava moment indeed. And where was Frank while all this was going on? Well, just before 8 bells, Frank stood with Bill Diggle, the ship's carpenter, at the aft end of the port side amidships centre castle, watching Atlantis' approach. They watched in open-mouthed astonishment as this mysterious vessel seemed to be heading straight for them. As she closed, Bill ran off to fetch his binoculars. He came back, and he and Frank took turns with the glasses to watch the developments. By Frank's reckoning, it was 08:30 when the fireworks started. He recalled the sea being as flat as a plate glass. He thought it funny, the things you remember at such highly emotive times. Before she had revealed herself, Bill Diggle had thought the Atlantis was a P&O intermediate and continued to watch in growing alarm as the distance between the ships closed, with neither vessel making any attempt to adjust course to avoid the impending collision. Then Frank recalled seeing sparks on Atlantis, followed by 4 puffs of white smoke coming from the side of this other ship. By this time, she was lying just forward of Automedon's port beam. Frank recalled hearing a loud bang followed by an almighty crash. This was the first salvo after the warning shot across the bows, and it landed on the bridge deck directly above them. This was followed in quick succession by more salvos, all of which were targeted on the centre castle housing, where the bridge officer's accommodation and saloon were located. Frank recollects that with each strike, Automedon seemed to shudder and scream. Assistant Steward Alan Parsons stood a few feet after where Frank and Bill Diggle stood. He ran to the starboard side as the first shells exploded on board and was caught by shrapnel from the second salvo as he passed number 3 hatch. The hatch coaming protected his lower body. His injuries were all sustained in his upper body. In severe pain, he managed to stagger into a deck lavatory where he collapsed. A German boarding party found him there later and swiftly zipped him into a body bag and whisked him off to the hospital aboard Atlantis for surgery. He was conscious by this time and remembers having to wait his turn while the two German surgeons worked on Chief Steward Percy Moseley from Heswall. It was Frank who had first found the wounded Chief Steward. The surgeons eventually did an excellent job on Parsons, who recovered fully and carried remnants of shrapnel buried deep in his chest for the rest of his life. The blast came as a shock for Frank. Though stunned, he remembered holding his body rigid and remained standing as the blast passed him. The awning above his head shredded, while the stanchions that remained were twisted and buckled. It was a marvel that he remained uninjured. He turned to talk to Bill Diggle and was surprised to find him no longer beside him. The carpenter had bolted forward. Frank's attention was next drawn to one of the crew trying to lower a Carley life raft into the water from the poop deck. Then another seaman, possibly the gunner, caught his eye as he ran towards Automaton's 4-inch gun on the after deck. Frank noticed the raider now stood off close on her port quarter and was so near he could see and hear an officer on a bridge shouting at them in English through a loudhailer, "Don't go near the gun, or we'll blow you out of the water." Frank insisted he heard this quite clearly. This episode is also recorded in the Atlantis' war diary and translates as, "Bombardment resumed, although transmissions had ceased because a figure was seen approaching the gun on the afterdeck of Automaton, which had turned its stern towards Atlantis." The Germans thought the blue funneler was about to fight back, and Rogger had ordered 3 salvos fired onto the forecastle and poop decks. Another war diary entry reads, "All were on target." In justification for the resumption of the bombardment, Captain Rogger wrote in his memoir, "I deduced from the man apparently running for the gun after the vessel had apparently turned its stern to Atlantis that Automaton was about to fight back. With repairs difficult to engineer for a ship such as this, raiders' crews took even the slightest risk seriously." This episode left Frank with a sour taste, he says, in his mouth for the rest of his life. He recalled with the utmost disdain the total absence of any machine gun or rifle fire from Atlantis. He said the ships were so close by each other that a single rifle shot would have downed the man running for the gun, but Rogger decided instead to use his artillery, and at such a close range. Why didn't he shoot the man instead of executing a further barrage on an already crippled ship? Atlantis' war diary records 12 shells were fired in rapid succession at Automaton at point-blank range. Frank rushed back inside the wrecked deck below the bridge housing, where he came across Chief Steward Percy Moseley lying on the deck and in a bad way. He said he had lost a lot of blood and was writhing in agony. Frank found him a blanket in a nearby cabin, covered him up and gave him a drink of water. He said I didn't know what else I could do for him. Then he grabbed me and asked me to find an envelope in his cabin and pass it on to the second steward, which I did. It turned out to be a ready-made goodbye letter to his family, should he have to suffer the circumstances such as the ones that had befallen him. I guess he knew he was dying. Frank said it was hard for me to console the man. I could see his life was ebbing away. I then noticed Alex Parsons from Wallasey lying on the other side of the hatchway with his chest all smashed up. It was eerie because it was quiet after all the noise, like a deathly silence had fallen about the place. The next thing I knew, the Germans had arrived carrying revolvers and with hand grenades fixed on their belts. I could see they were all armed and by their determined manner ready for any situation. I don't think they were proud of their handiwork and became very subdued when they witnessed the carnage and devastation they had caused us with their 5.9-inch shells. We were sitting ducks to them. The boarding party went about their business efficiently. I found out later they'd had plenty of practice. We were their 13th target in just over 6 months. Interestingly, a page in Rogger's diary records, "Automaton's master had ignored my warnings and paid for it with his life." Rogger justified his action by writing that my own survival depended on no alarms being raised. The boarding party set about looking after the injured and dying. The badly wounded were rapidly sent across to the Atlantis, where they received proper medical and surgical treatment in the mini hospital they had on board. Sad, but Chief Steward Moseley and AB Joe Watts from Albert Edward Road, Liverpool, died shortly after being transferred to the Raider. Even the forecastle head had been hit with their shells. The forward port side rails had been ripped from their mountings and lay around in macabre, twisted sculptures. They found the chippy, Bill Diggle, lying dead beside the windlass. Bill from London wouldn't have known what hit him when that shell landed beside him. All the boats and their davits were smashed and fragmented. The funnel had some gaping holes in quite a few places. The bridge and the officer's deck below was completely destroyed and a shambles. In a matter of 5 minutes, we had 4 dead, with 2 dying, and a dozen more wounded, some badly. We had 56 Chinese seamen as part of the crew. They were on their way back to Hong Kong. One of them received a serious wound below the belt and lamented his loss in pidgin English that would have been funny had it not been for real. I never knew if the poor blighter made it at all. One would have thought the loss of Automaton, and with it the possibility of the enemy capturing the ultra-secret document she carried, would have motivated every person, plane and powers that be to seek her out and find the truth. But they decided to ignore her loss as if it had never happened, and to maintain this pretense even until long after the war. The Australian Navy sent this secret message on the 14th of November about Automaton being attacked, although it was as if Automaton had got herself lost at sea. Another mystery that intrigues me concerns the requirement under the Merchant Shipping Acts concerning ships lost at sea and the month time limit for their owners to deliver a copy of the lost articles of agreement signed by the crew and have them legally closed on their behalf, stating reasons for the loss of ship and life. Mr. Shipston of Holt Line did this for Automaton and submitted them for closure to the Mercantile Marine Office in Birkenhead on the 14th of January 1941. I have a copy of them here, all fully made out, and it accurately, meticulously made up and accurately lists those who lost their lives and those who became prisoners of war. Now there's a mystery. How ever did Mr. Shipston know who had died, who was made into a POW on the 14th of January 1941? The Automaton crew were still captives aboard the Atlantis on that date. The Red Cross could not be involved, and I'm sure Captain Rogger, notwithstanding him being a humane gentleman of the sea, would not have cabled the Department of Transport in London with these details. And with Whitehall doing its utmost to deny the loss of Automaton to a raider, how on earth did Mr. Shipston of Holt's know how to accurately complete these documents? Mystery. But they were accurate, and 16-year-old Frank was now a prisoner of war. But he wasn't the youngest aboard Atlantis. That dubious honour belonged to 15-year-old Leslie McDermott Brown, an apprentice taken from Paddy Henderson's SS Kemmendine. Here's Frank's discharge book page. When he returned to see it was made up for him, here we can see Frank's discharge book, properly made up with him going off articles and off pay on the 11th of November 1940, with him going into captivity as a POW, made up obviously after the war. And there's another little mystery to think about. This is his first discharge book. You can see it in the earlier pages. It lists his earlier CPR voyages. How on earth did it survive for him to use when he continued his seafaring career at war's end? How come he had it with him? I have an idea, but I'll tell you later. The Atlantis. Gross Admiral Erich Rieder ran Hitler's navy. He built a new force of sleek capital warships, but tiny in numbers when compared to the massive strength of the Royal Navy that it would face whenever war came. He knew Britain required 55 million tons of imports annually to sustain it in 1939, and the prime task of his navy would be to interfere with the flow of Britain's commerce. His new surface warships, with their large crews, would be insufficient and likely to be hunted down by the Royal Navy's vastly superior numbers. Germany had hitherto been denied submarines under the Versailles Treaty, and Rieder's mind settled on armed merchant cruisers, warships disguised as merchant vessels, a development of the successful Q-ship concept of World War I. In 1937, he ordered 7 cargo ships for operation in the DDG Hansa Shipping Company, with some modifications to convert them to surface raiders when needed. Atlantis was the most successful of these. Known also as Sheaf 16, she was a 5-hatch vessel of 7,862 gross registered tons, 155 metres length overall, 18.7 metres beam, powered by 2 6-cylinder diesel engines on a single shaft, and she sailed on a summer draft of 8.7 metres, 29 feet. Commissioned as an armed merchant cruiser on the 19th of December 1939, her armament consisted of 6 5.9-inch naval guns, 1 3-inch gun, 2 twin 1.5-inch anti-aircraft guns, 2 twin 0.79-inch cannons, 4 533mm torpedo tubes, and 93 contact mines. She also carried 2 Heinkel seaplanes and was equipped with a dummy funnel and variable height masts to disguise her by emulating the configuration of other merchant ships. Her complement comprised 367 officers and men, and her weaponry was concealed behind pivotable false deck structures to maintain her merchant vessel subterfuge. To maintain her presence when stalking or sailing in close quarter with other vessels, she would also have crewmen dressed as nannies wheeling prams about her decks. And in that slide you can see one of her 5.9-inch guns that's cased up and now ready for action. Her singular function was to patrol the vastnesses of the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans to attack British tonnage. She was supplied through the German network of supply ships such as Altmark. This is the picture of her at sea and ready to go to work, taken from U-boat U-126. This is a photo of her in a favourite disguise as the SS Antenor, an ocean steamships liner commandeered by the Royal Navy as the armed merchant cruiser HMS Antenor. Rieder had chosen well when he selected Captain zur See Bernhard Rogger as Atlantis' commander. Rogger was a professional sailor who eventually served in 4 German navies. He served in the Kaiser's Navy and saw action at Jutland on the Moltke. During the Weimar Republic, he commanded the Navy's sail training vessel Albert Leo Schlagter. When Hitler's navy arrived, Problems arose for him since his grandmother was Jewish, and that made him a Jew. He could not legally occupy any government office or appointment. This proved a problem for Reeder, who wanted Rogge as the captain of Atlantis. He went directly to Hitler on Rogge's behalf and persuaded the Führer to grant him a Mishinga, a German blood declaration that allowed Rogge to describe himself as Aryan in government documents. Now he was of German blood. He could take up his planned appointment. Needless to say, Rogge was not a Nazi. And Rogge justified Reeder's faith in him by becoming the most successful of all surface raiders, having sunk 22 ships, totaling 145,960 gross registered tons during his time on Atlantis. There remained a sting in the tail for him, however. The blood document issued by the Ministry for Racial Affairs added a line at the bottom that declared his racial situation would be subject to review on cessation of hostilities. It was an hostilities-only relief. Although Rogge was no longer tormented or attacked by the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, this relief did not extend to his family. His wife and her mother had a Jewish grandmother and mother respectively, and such was the hounding and torment directed at them by the SA that they committed suicide in April 1939. When Bernhard Rogge took up his command of Atlantis, he had only his career and his small terrier, Ferry, left to him. Rogge was an enigmatic and devoutly religious man and the son of a Lutheran minister, a humane seaman who earned the respect of his captives, whom he would walk among with his little dog and talk to them. Yet he was doing his utmost to secure victory for Hitler's regime, as was his duty, and his success would result in him being reassessed for Jewishness. The Reich he had served so well could thus reassess him as another unwanted Jew. The Fourth Navy he served in was later as a vice admiral in the post-war NATO forces once the West German Navy was established after the war. Rogge conducted himself and commanded his ship in the nobler traditions of the sea. He lost a navy to sunstroke in the Indian Ocean. This is a picture of the deceased's burial at sea. The ship's company being assembled in their best uniforms to afford him honours. This is roughly the position where she attacked Automedon. Although the ship's location, 250 miles west-southwest of Bandar Assar and the entrance to the Bengal Strait for passage to Penang, the location was away from the main shipping lines. But Captain Rogge hastened the transfer of plunder should another vessel come along and see the two stationary vessels close by each other, realize what was happening, and radio a message to the British warships in the area that were hunting these raiders. Rogge set a time limit of 3 hours for the operation. There is evidence to suggest the Atlantis was searching for Automedon, that she had become a marked ship when she called at Durban by an Italian Secret Service cell operating in the port, who then passed on her details to the Abwehr, the German Secret Service, with whom they were working in close coordination. Papers were found in Berlin at the end of the war to support this theory, yet it cannot be verified that she was tracked. Many of Rogge's attacks were by subterfuge and trickery, and succeeded even without a shot being fired. In those cases, the whole ship will be captured, including her code books, as was the Port Wellington. The Germans could, therefore, monitor Automedon's coded position messages. When Atlantis' lookout, A.B. Jenner, spotted smoke on the horizon and Rogge checked it out, he said in his memoir, "We spotted each other about the same time. As she came more into view, I could recognize the graceful blue funnel lines of Automedon." It does suggest he was expecting to sight her. The attack proceeded as outlined earlier. boarding parties went aboard under the command of Captain Rogger's First Lieutenant Ulrich Moore. The extent of the destruction they had caused surprised even the German boarding party. Another entry of the Atlantis War Diary records, "The automaton presented itself as a picture of devastation. Lieutenant zur See Ulrich Moore, who had led the German boarding party, and said afterwards that the close-range shelling had destroyed virtually every structure above the hull, and there was nothing left undamaged above the first deck." He wrote in his own memoir, "I was horrified to see the death, bloodshed, and the mangled remains of the ship's superstructures caused by just a few shells, and luckily our Frank was unharmed." He wrote later of an eerie silence that prevailed over the shocking extent of the devastation, save for the sound of escaping steam from broken pipes, much the same eeriness that Frank had mentioned. We now pick up the tale in Frank's words. "The German boarding party set about ransacking the ship. They used us to help transfer stores and goods. They took all of the frozen meat, all of the fags, and the other stores, plus 550 cases of Scotch whisky, transporting it in a small fleet of motorboats across to the Atlantis. While some of them opened the hatches, others set about breaking into the strong room and making a systematic search like they were looking for something in particular. When we found out later, it astonished us what they did find. We didn't know we were carrying highly confidential documents in with the mail. Out of the 120 bags of mail for the troops in Singapore, they got 15 bags of Navy cipher tables, Royal Navy sailing orders, government papers, new merchant Navy codes, and other secret documents and reports that Britain's defences in Malaya were under strength and lacking in air support. But even that prize haul was nothing compared to the document they found when they decided to go rummaging around in the ruins and debris in the old chart room. There, they found an envelope addressed to the Commander-in-Chief British Far Forces from the Planning Department of the War Cabinet in Whitehall. It was for his eyes only. I found out later that it gave a highly detailed evaluation of the British military strength with details of its lack of naval power, along with instructions to the RAF for the defence of Singapore, listing their available aircraft types and the airworthy numbers of each. It said also that Japan must know that Britain would be unable to send more aircraft, and that the British Far East Fleet was seriously under strength. It noted Japan's desire for expansion. The report concluded that Britain must avoid aggravating Japan, even if this meant making economic concessions, something that both Britain and the USA had always opposed. It included detailed notes on the defences of Singapore, an assessment of the role of Australia and New Zealand should play in the event of Japan entering the war. It had everything a potential foe with his eyes on Singapore and beyond would wish for, and more yet. Like the other things from the strong room, this was marked classified, destroy in an emergency. It is likely that Captain Ewan did not know of the secret documents hidden in the mailbags in his strong room and could not have got them out for disposal if he wished to do so. But he certainly would have known about the Far East Appreciation Report found in the destroyed chart room, for it was in his charge. It is a reasonable assumption that he had been briefed to dispose of it over the side should there be a risk of it becoming exposed to an enemy, for he kept it ready at hand to heave from the bridge wing in the event of trouble. Whether or not he had sufficient time to do this before he was killed is an exoneration that history will deny him. Whatever the circumstances of his personal situation, this precious document now resided in German hands. Rogger and Moore both had a command of English, and at first pored over this intelligence cornucopia with unbelieving eyes. Rogger believed it a true find. In his memoir, he notes being troubled about their authenticity because they were found on an elderly and virtually unarmed merchantman instead of being conveyed on a warship. He sent them to Admiral Veneker, the German naval attaché in Tokyo, aboard the Norwegian prize tanker Ole Jacob, for on-sending to Berlin and then to be shared with the Japanese government. Thus, this ultra-secret document passed into enemy hands and served to accelerate Japan's entry into the war and to extend what had until then been essentially a European affair into a world war. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was always said to be quietly confident his aircraft carriers could wipe out the US Pacific Fleet, but he harbored the fear he would have to face a British fleet in retaliation should he do so. The Ottoman Papers removed that fear and helped propel the Japanese Empire into war with the United States and ultimately into its own destruction. Before we leave the automaton to her fate, we have to mention Mrs. Ferguson's tea set, if only for completeness. This is a story that resounds through British archives, but is unsubstantiated in their German counterparts. The story has all the hallmarks of the chinless wonder fiction writers employed at Broadway buildings, the former London premises occupied by the President residence of Thames House, MI6. It is a fact that Violet Ferguson and her Irish husband, Alan Ferguson, were passengers on Automaton and were returning to Singapore, where he worked as a ship's engineer with Straits steamships. An over-elaborate story, beloved of historical fiction bloggers, exists to blame her for the Germans entering the strong room and finding the codes and sensitive material secured therein. The story runs that boarding officer Ulrich Moore, being pressed for time in plundering the ship, had not located the strong room, which was secreted in the forecastle. Moore had looked at his watch, called time on the transfer of stores, and given everybody on board 15 minutes to pack a small case of personal belongings before transferring them all to the Atlantis. Mrs. Ferguson is reputed to have approached Moore and asked if he would get her prized tea set out of the not wanted on voyage baggage room that happened to be the strong room. Moore is said to have obliged the lady, opened the strong room and found an intelligence treasure trove. In his memoir, Moore does not recall this conversation and talks more of the difficulty and importance in opening the ship's safe, in which he found only a few shillings in cash. Among the goodies in the strong room, however, they found also $6 million in new Malay currency on its way to Singapore. Thames House and its forerunners always enjoy a happy ending to their stories, and so Mrs. Ferguson's tale carries one also. She became a prisoner of war with her husband. However, on reaching Germany, she was transferred to Liebenau internment camp on the Swiss border, near to Lake Constance. This was a camp where prisoners chosen for exchange were assembled. Here she enjoyed tea parties with her beloved tea set until 1943, when she was repatriated to Britain, but without the tea set. She is reunited with her husband in 1945. That's a fact. However, the story continues that the Kriegsmarine had meanwhile carefully stowed her tea set in a naval warehouse in Hamburg until the day it could be reunited with its owner. And so they were. So the story goes. By the way, does anybody here recall the pictures of Hamburg's warehouses in 1945? Perhaps an elegantly dressed and dapper gentleman with a soft Scots accent who introduced himself as Bond, James Bond, handed it to her. I think that's enough about the tea set story, which may have happened, may have not. Dr. Goebbels was quite anxious to draw propaganda value from Rogger's attempt. And here we see here a picture of that he published in the Stern newspaper in Germany. And it gave, and Brugger was pretty angry about this because it gave away what he was doing, where he was, drew attention to them, and he wished to remain anonymous. But water was always the big problem. And on the left, there's a picture of them at Kerguelen Island. It's a small island that's an old whaling station that's right on the border of the Antarctic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And that's where he drew his water. But on the other side, they decided to print photographs of the automaton being scuttled. And that's what you're seeing there. But back to there. Automaton Ship's Company were now prisoners of war aboard Atlantis. When all were checked on board Atlantis, they were lined up to face their ship while the scuttling charges exploded and sank her. Many of her crew turned their backs on this sight. Atlantis tended to supply herself when needs arose by capturing tankers and refrigerated vessels to replenish her bunkers and storerooms, and was successful in this. When she could not wholly resupply herself, she would be succoured by the German Navy supply network of vessels such as Thor and Altmark. She also played her part in this supply network, refueling and supplying the larger surface vessels and U-boats operating in the southern hemisphere. Ships captured intact by Atlantis were dispatched to wait at specific points in the South Indian Ocean for orders. There were two such points, Mongeese, 300 miles south of the equator and close to the secondary station, Point Roton, at 0330 south, 09315 east. When the captured vessels were of no further use to him, their crews would be transferred aboard Atlantis and the ship dispatched to the deep. This pic is taken from Ole Jacob and shows Atlantis sinking the Norwegian products tanker Teddy at the end of its useful life to the Reich. Frank tells us in his notes that they were interviewed and searched soon after boarding. Items of so-called contraband and value were taken off them, for which they were given Third Reich promissory receipts. Then they were assembled on deck and lined up as a group for photographing. Officers, ratings, passengers, and the ship's cat too if it got itself into a boat. I don't have a pic for the automaton photograph, but this one is taken aboard Penguin, another raider, of the passengers, and is of crew of the ships that she had attacked, that included No Shearer, a British India vessel. Frank said the food and conditions weren't bad on Atlantis. They were always hungry and water was strictly rationed, but they were let out into the fresh air often and they were treated with respect on the whole. Frank said, if we treated them with respect, we got it back. They were given a small tobacco and cigarette allowance. Frank reckoned it could have been a more generous allowance since they had taken 2.5 million fags that he didn't know about on board, and he had helped him shift them. Captain Rogger encouraged sports and pastimes. Boxing was a favourite of his. He'd walk among us with Ferry, his little terrier, that was the ship's mascot, and talk to us. He'd answer reasonable questions as best he could. We got to trust him a bit. He became highly regarded by us for his fair play and sense of humanity. But he would never allow bouts between Germans and Brits, however much we asked him. A fight between Germans and Norwegians was okay, and we could fight Norwegians or anybody else, but not Germans. We suppose it was because Norskes were considered to be like Germans, now their country was occupied and run from Berlin. We had all the fresh air we wanted, but were battened down when she attacked other ships. While we're on board, she added 3 more to her score and to her bank of prisoners. It was getting a bit crowded now. Frank describes Captain Rogger as a gentleman. He looked after them as well as he could, and he held the respect of all on board. He would talk openly to everybody as he walked his little terrier around the deck. Sprightly little thing, loved by all. Well, most of us. There's always the miseries everywhere. Rogger found a bloke doing a sketch and suggested he start an art class. Can you imagine suggesting to some of them old salts we had with us, them who had served their time on square riggers, that they should start an art class? It beggars the imagination how they might go about it. Frank said we were on board Atlantis for about a month before she got so overcrowded they had to move us on, and called up another of their captive ships, the Norwegian tanker Storstad, to take us on board and deliver us to wherever we were going. Never could any of us imagine the repercussions that would follow at the end of next year from us carrying that green canvas envelope and Captain Ewan not managing to throw it overboard. The Japanese were extremely grateful to this lowly captain and presented him with a katana, the highest military honour. Only 2 other Germans had received this award, Goering and Rommel. The end eventually came to Atlantis. She had been ordered to refuel U-68 in the South Atlantic and then proceed north of Ascension Island to replenish U-126. Bletchley codebreakers picked up the message and the Admiralty sent HMS Devonshire to meet them. On the 22nd of November 1941, she arrived to find Atlantis in the process of refueling the submarine with her captain, allegedly on board the raider taking a shower. U-126's first lieutenant took command. He cast off the hose and dived, leaving an oil trace behind as she slipped away. At this time, Frank and his crowd are on the Storstad, another ship that are not on the Atlantis. Atlantis got underway in an attempt to draw Devonshire south. Captain Oliver of the Devonshire stayed well out of range of Atlantis's guns. From 10 miles, his first salvo straddled Atlantis. Captain Oliver had found the range, and Rogger wrote in his memoir that he knew the game was up. He set smoke screens and ordered Lieutenant Failer, his demolition officer, to set scuttling charges, and ordered abandoned ship as the next shells from Devonshire penetrated the smoke screen and landed on target. Captain Rogger was grateful to Captain Oliver for setting delayed action fuses to his shells. He wrote in his memoir, "It showed the humanity of Devonshire's commander in his wish to minimize human casualties. Had he set on contact fuses, the injuries and loss of life from shrapnel would have been unthinkable." Rogger scuttled Atlantis and his crew took to the boats. It was the end of a tour of duty of 655 consecutive days in which they destroyed 22 ships, totaling 145,960 gross registered tons. That followed. Devonshire, acutely aware of a submarine attack, kept moving and could not intervene. U-68 was around and had fired 1 torpedo at Devonshire that had missed. Devonshire left the survivors to their fate, lowered her battle ensign, and departed the scene. That's a picture of them in the boats, obviously. And not a man was lost. U-boats in the area towed the boats clear of the scene until a team of 4 Italian submarines and 4 U-boats, organised by the Kriegsmarine, assembled and took all 366 men on board of those cramped and tiny boats and delivered them safely to Nantes. I regret I have no information concerning the fate of Rogger's Terrier ferry. Hitler awarded Rogger the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award, the equivalent of awarding him a Victoria Cross twice. Rogger eventually went back to sea as commander of the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. He became the only German officer of flag rank who was not arrested at the end of the war. And at this time, Frank was battened down under a forward cargo hatch on board the Norwegian tanker Stansted. And Mr. Chairman, I think we might leave it there if you wish. Thank you very much. Thank you.